Hello, everybody, friends, countrymen. Lend me your ears. It's Garrett Sussman of iPullRank Agency Demand Generation Manager for Rankable Live. And transparently, I was just telling John, our guest, who I will introduce in a second, this is the last Rankable Live that I'll be doing for a good month plus. I'm going on about a month-long hiatus, but don't worry. We're going to do kind of a new format starting March 3rd, where our senior digital marketing specialist, Aaron Johnson, who this dude's rocking. I'm already excited for you to see some of the content he's creating. Check out our TikTok channel. But he's going to start doing a more of a case study deep dive version of the podcast. So it's going to be awesome. But today I'm excited. I am joined by an in-house amazing gentleman. I get the privilege of working with him every day. The director of software engineering at iPullRank, John Murch. Thanks for joining me, John.
Thanks for having me here. Super excited and pumped, and yeah, big fan. So finally get to jump on the stage.
Well, I mean, you and I, like, we internally on our Slack channels are always geeking out about SEO. You're always kind of paying attention to things in marketing. You're a Pittsburgh-based developer. You know, you stumbled into SEO while building WordPress websites in 2005. You've done in-house, you've done consulting. Now you're building some ridiculous tools for iPullRank and big plug. So John, find him on Twitter at John Murch. He just started a Technical SEO Weekly newsletter where he's kind of rounding up very much a like focus on the GitHub repositories out there, all the cool things that are happening in technical SEO. You want to talk real quick about what the newsletter's got in it?
Yeah, it just kind of started because I find a lot of interesting code snippets and repos and just random things here and there that I think are a bit technical for people, unless you can program in Python or JavaScript. But some of the things aren't. But I just wanted a place to kind of put it and get it out there because I feel like I'm copying and pasting messages, sending to people, being like, "Hey, check this out. This is cool." And so now I'm like, okay, like go sign up for my newsletter and we'll broadcast that out. So.
It's awesome too because it's interesting. You were asking, we were talking about it, and there really aren't a lot of like this type of technical SEO newsletter out there. Like how big or niche do you think the technical SEO community is at this point in terms of technical SEOs who actually are engineers, are developers? It's not relatively huge, right?
Yeah, I don't think it's that big, but I feel like there's also a lot of developers who do things that may not post up about it or maybe not realize like the implications of what they're doing and how useful it could be to others, or just even just a way to see like how somebody else is doing something and go from there. So.
I mean, that's the world of code too, right? Like no matter where you're going, like whenever you have a problem, there's gonna be more than one solution, and just seeing like how so much of it is just the way you think about a technical problem. So having that, it's exciting. I think it's cool that you're really doing it. Let's dive in. I'm curious, how'd you get into SEO in the first place? Mentioned something about WordPress websites.
Yeah, so actually in college, went to the University of Vermont, studied computer science. I was building WordPress sites for some teachers as a paid gig on campus. And basically that kind of led to my role after college, moved to New York City, worked for Ziff Davis, building out some of their blogs and podcasts, kind of got into a bit more of the affiliate space, toolbar marketing, which was kind of interesting, which led me down building some SEO tools and trying to, I guess, kind of feed my own need, realizing there's things that I wanted to do and go from there. And that kind of led me to doing one SEO rank dragging tool project and then doing into consulting. And within there, I also built a t-shirt blanket business that was kind of a fun pet project. But yeah, and then basically from consulting, I actually went in-house and then did that for a while and then kind of switched gears and went more on the technical side, doing development, building a large CRM system for a Fortune 500 company, dove into some of the kind of dev work on the mobile side with mobile apps, built and launched an IoT product for a large company, and then kind of built a lot of proof of concept projects. Got to go to CES. That was a lot of fun. And then kind of dove into web crawling and scraping. And kind of, I guess, more my recent role before iPullRank was doing some work with vehicle telematics and connected cars.
Very cool. I mean, yeah, you said like in your spare time, you're always playing with like Raspberry Pi these days and coming out with like
Yeah,
ridiculous use cases for that.
got one right here.
What are you working on right now? Any secret projects?
Uh, well, no, but I did find some large data from a sitemap that I thought was fascinating. So just scrape the sitemap and then scrape the page and then pull out some of the data. Um, yeah.
That's really cool. So web scraping, you've been kind of obsessed with rank tracking for a while now and have worked on these different projects. And as someone who is trying to kind of navigate what rank tracking is in 2022, you're in the SERPs constantly. And the SERPs are changing rapidly. What are you seeing recently that's like caught your eye in terms of some of these new, types of enhancements that are coming up, and why do you think it's important?
Yeah, I think what's really fascinating is just how real time Google is getting. So if I do a search at 9 a.m., the Best Buy near me is closed, and it will say that Best Buy is closed, but it's opening soon. Um, Similarly, if products are in stock, out of stock, seeing things like there. But it's also interesting. I do a lot of requests from different locations and seeing what comes back there, which different rich snippet is shown for a different keyword. So it's been kind of interesting seeing, I guess, the change of the SERP over the years.
Well, I mean, that's really interesting, like the incremental rank tracking, because the idea is if you are doing something, especially I'm sure local has the biggest impact on if you have any sort of local search, like if you're beyond just the hours of operation, like the in stock, out stock product, like what direction do you think that's going in? And as an SEO, is there anything you can really do to control it?
I think there's kind of a few things in it. Obviously, it's leveraging some of the kind of semantics that Google's given you with, structured data, kind of going from there. But there's kind of other things that I would say of like just how you optimize or think about your product. If you're an e-commerce store, what platform are you on? What kind of data feeds are you providing to get that data out there and to, hopefully rank, as well as to, I would say, look at different features that appear on some of the keywords and what competitors are doing and what on their page is leading to that result.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too, to your point about the data that's being fed in, where you're starting to see some examples where Google's pulling information that's not using structured data, but it feels like structured data is always an an opportunity to have a competitive advantage if you're actually utilizing it. What's kind of your thought in terms of as an SEO implementing it? Like, is it? Are we going to get to a point where it doesn't matter, or is it always going to be like a competitive advantage?
Well, I'd say it definitely doesn't. I wouldn't say it doesn't matter, but I'd say that if you're a larger enterprise company that has millions of web pages, you're more likely to get a lot more content pickup. And if you're a smaller player trying to compete against those, that could definitely help with having proper syntax and structure. But I would say that at some point, and you're even seeing this in like a mobile SERP for, let's say, Best Buy and AirPods, you actually get an experience of like viewing the product within the SERP, and then it's just like a click to buy. So I definitely feel like it's kind of interesting seeing like, do you even need a web page where it's like just getting that data into Google and it all being within the SERP? So.
I mean, it's scary to some extent for content creators, right? Because the idea is, as Google, like for instance, to your point, recently Google started rolling out or testing buying guides in e-commerce. So, showing all this data that's maybe pulled from the original seller or from the affiliate. Like, as an SEO, is there anything, do you want to show up in those pills, in those interstitials that Google's providing, or do you want to just be the organic result and hope that you're getting the traffic to your website?
Yeah, well, I mean, even if you're the organic result, you may be so far down the page, below the fold or scrolling. So, it's kind of a good and bad of being where you are, right? Creating great content, getting traffic from Google, is kind of the good with it, but you also, just giving up your data for them to consume and go from there. So,
And, I mean, that's a problem too, because it's like, well, when you're looking at the way that we rank track in the past, it was always like just the 10 blue links, like just where are you ranking, relatively in terms of your organic. But like, are SEOs using pixel height? Like, are people taking that into consideration when they're trying to report on the performance of their content?
I think they're starting to. I feel like with pixel height, it depends on the tool and it depends on, the specific SERP. So we know with mobile, they now have the continuous scroll, right? So everyone's on page one. Um, but yeah, I think it's, important to understand the landscape. It's kind of interesting reflecting back of like how things have changed. So there was a client I used to do work for where we wanted to really own local. So we bought, I think it was like 1,500 domains, like every keyword, city, state, and just like build out pages and just go as broad as we can. And they got crushed with a few penalties after Google, did not like that. But it's just interesting. It's again this cat and mouse game of what works. But if you kind of focus on the, I guess, play within the rules, you're still rewarded with traffic.
It's interesting to your point too about mobile versus desktop. It almost seems like in addition to focusing on the appearance of rich snippets and pixel height, depending on the device, you actually have to look at rank tracking differently depending on the device. Like, if you rank at a certain place on mobile, it's going to be different than where you rank on desktop, and it's going to probably generate a different amount of traffic. And so you probably invest resources differently depending on that query and that device.
Yeah, it definitely makes it a bit more intensive, right? Because now you're looking at location, you're looking at device, you know, you you're looking at different placement and understanding the different features within it. So there's a lot of things to look at, even if it's just one, simple term. It's also interesting to keep in mind, just every rank tracker at its core is just starting with basically a fresh search, right? There's no history or something like that. Whereas, like most people, they don't delete all their cookies and start fresh every time they do a search. So there's some, history. So there's kind of an interesting balance with that. But it's definitely fascinating to compare and see, what's going on with it, as well as just the differences on mobile. There's so many more images and so many more different things that aren't on desktop searches. So yeah.
Wait, you don't delete your cookies every time you could do a new search?
It depends, right?
No, but that being said, so let's talk about kind of what's your bread and butter, which is web scraping. You've built a lot of bots over the years, and obviously, when you're web scraping, whether you're building your own scraper or getting data from someone else, there's a lot of data and info like in the SERPs. What are you looking for when you build a bot to scrape that data?
Yeah, so kind of to get a step back from it a bit. So, like, one kind of methodology I always think about is failing first. So, if your resource either blocking you or, maybe that data you need to be getting from another different source, um, it is definitely kind of a challenge. The other one is more of backfilling or caching. So, with caching, so for example, you may be testing your script and just running it. Well, you don't want to keep running it against what you're going to be scraping later. You need a cache source so that you can work on testing your script and iterate versus you kind of open up the floodgates and go from there. Another thing to keep in mind that I always like to do is more back of the envelope counting. So how many seconds are in a day and how many requests do I need to do? So there's 86,400 seconds in a day. So if you're doing 100,000 requests, they need to happen under a second. It's going to either take more than a day, or you need to do different threads and servers in order to do that. So maybe you have, 2 or 5 or 10 different servers running these requests. So yeah, it's definitely fascinating.
It's interesting because you really do have to think about your resources and the timing of everything. And to your point about like the failures, I remember working at companies in the past, the idea, like for instance, whenever trying to scrape Google is a completely different experience than trying to scrape Amazon. right? Because like Amazon's like a moving target all the time. They're not going to like block you, or Amazon's going to block you more than Google is, right?
Yeah, it's definitely interesting, and I would kind of call that out, right? Like what work is whoever you're scraping from putting in a barrier to stop you from scraping, and what is that, right? So like early on with Google, they would show you like a captcha or whatever, and so it's like, okay, go get a new proxy and start again, like no big deal, right? But it's more interesting where like other companies are doing different checks on your requests to see like, are certain things running, does this exist, like, do I have access to location, just there's a lot of other things that you may need to consider when you're scraping, and some of it definitely gets kind of interesting as like an aggregate or like a workaround. So like a while back, I had a post about crawling without crawling, where basically I would just scrape sitemaps to get all the URLs. So rather than have to me like go through and iterate, it's like, well, I can just like massively, dump all these URLs and then do a compare. So like in the case of this, I had a project where I was comparing what is sold in Walmart but not Target. And so a lot of it was able to do just that, where it's like, well, you can pull out so much data from the URLs without actually hammering the site.
That's, I mean, to your point, there's so much data, and yet I'm curious, what are some of the limitations of web scrapers, specifically for SEO? Like, what can't you do?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's very little. I'm a huge fan of Puppeteer, which is basically Chrome. And there's a lot of things and settings that, again, that there may be blockades or things they're checking, but with various proxies as well as some of the newer technologies of leveraging cellular for proxies, it just kind of opens up the floodgates from there. So I mean, it's definitely been fascinating.
When you look at the data, so like for instance, and this is where I'm out of my depth, but like obviously you can get most of the SERP info, like rich, snippet info, structured data. For instance, with like mum coming out, and they're going to provide all this additional navigational data that tries to push you into a refined query. Is that something that you can web scrape, or is that not, like, do you anticipate that not being accessible?
I think it's just more of like actions and resource and costs. So I think some of this stuff is going to cost more in order to fetch or aggregate because it requires more things to do, whether it be to like showcase a pogo sticking in order to get Google to fire off something within a SERP to say, hey, this is people also search for this. And you're like, oh, okay, that's interesting. I didn't see that when this SERP loaded, but if I pogo stick and then come back, I can pull that, just other things like that. The other one is obviously just reading the code and seeing more of what they're doing, and parsing from there, and kind of going from there. So
Gotcha. Like, so basically like reverse engineering whatever you can pull.
yeah, and to that point, like one thing I'm also a big fan of is either like a playback feature. So basically taking your historic request of whatever that is and then being able to replay it. So I had a few providers where their data wasn't right, and I basically wanted a way to replay it. And so I had the original HTML that I could then basically reparse and then get the data that I did want from it, whereas the original their parsing broke, and yeah, went from there. So
Well, I mean, that's a perfect segue, because I am curious about like SEO data providers. There are a ton out there, and it's a bit of a wild west where you kind of have to figure out like what is quality data, what is not. Like you have a lot of experience doing this. What do you look for in an SEO data provider?
yeah, so I would say like the key thing is obviously consistency. So, I will run a certain query different times of days and, expect to see certain things, over and over, as well as like some of my more go-tos of like, okay, I know this SERP really well that has this many features, or, I would think, let me run through this and see like, does, these things check the box. I also will say it's interesting just the amount of metadata and the structure of the payload of what they're providing back. So in the case of indents, like how is that provided back or showcased, or even just how they describe some of the features. Something as simple as the knowledge panel, like what all data are they sending back, other than there was a knowledge panel on the SERP. So
Right. Because they're coming up with a lot of their own definitions. And so it's like if they don't have good documentation of how they're providing the parse data, like you kind of have to figure it out for yourself to some extent.
yeah, it's always interesting, right? So everyone's always like, "Oh wow, that's weird," right? Let me take a screenshot and tweet at Barry, like, "Is this new?" And it's like, well, it probably happened, but like, do we have a word for it? Like, how do you describe that? And that's something that I definitely been struggling in, where like there's certain things where I see, or I'll see, Barry post, but then it's like we need a name for these things, like, and kind of go from there. So.
That's a really interesting like situation. I'm trying to think of if was there anything recently you can think of that was like that came out and nobody knew what to call it, and so it just led to confusion for the data providers, or so there's different carousels. There's different. I'm trying to think of like.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing specific that I know, but like I guess there's a few things here and there with some of the like the FAQs within the results that show it there. Um, I feel like sometimes those are named differently, or provided differently in the payloads. But yeah, I mean it's interesting, right? So like there's also just so much change at Google of either killing products that were part of a SERP and are not anymore, right? Like it's so funny to see people still talk about like Google Plus, and it's like this is not a thing. Like we can
It's
move
been a
on.
long time since Google Plus, and it's I try not to be a judgmental person, but it's so hard when you go to a website and you see someone still rocking their Google Plus, let alone like the fact of it showing up in a SERP in some capacity. I'm curious now. So we talked a little bit about web scraping and the different types of data, but like getting that data into a good pipeline for reporting, like how do you define that? How do you define like a good data pipeline?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess a few things with it. So it's more of just like what kind of alerts do you need to bake in to like how your data is either getting refreshed or even processed, right? Or how do you even know what's like coming in on the other end is like correct? So like, are there cases of like nulls or like empty quotes or some of the other nuances of the developer forgot to parse this thing? Um, so yeah, there's kind of things with that. There's kind of I guess a bit more with just anomaly detections. Like, what are the things that like really changed that you may not be aware of, right? So it's kind of interesting. Like rank tracking is all about your changes, but not necessarily maybe of the SERP changes of being able to see competitors and things like that.
I feel like that's a big thing that's challenging. Going back to earlier in the conversation about location and timing, about how frequently the SERPs change is like when you're looking at a moment in time, and there's always going to be elements that are slightly changing, pulling the right data, and not like gaslighting yourself to see if it's correct, because it probably is going to be different, especially for like local queries, for instance.
Oh yeah, 100%. Like, I mean, that's kind of the thing is like you have your guardrails of like, okay, I expect to get like this type of data, but like every now and again, you're like, what is that? Like, when did that happen, right? And it could just be some nuanced thing, right? So like Valentine's Day was Monday. There could have been I was pulling the SERP coming in to posted about it. And it was just so fascinating to see like the ads and just how crowded that SERP was. But it's so focused. If like I'm doing the search from Pittsburgh versus doing the search from New York or something, it's just so different. But yet, again, same term, right?
Okay, I'm gonna put you on the spot because we didn't discuss this, but I'm very curious with all of the rank tracking tools. They all have their data and they all put out these like volatility reports, which is kind of what we're talking about of like how much the SERPs are fluctuating. how much weight or value do you put into the, like, based on, not knowing the data, or like how reliable it is, how much value do you put into these different tools and their volatility reports? Like, is it BS or is there some
Oh,
legitimacy?
well, obviously there's some math to it, right? At some point, and there could be even just like the developer of math where it's like, oh, you just multiply it by two and take the fifth one, and you're like, well, there's no logic there, but sure, sounds great. Um, but I mean, what's kind of hard, or I guess interesting to me, is the transparency of like, how did we get here? Like, how is this calculated? Let me show you, and like, here's an example, and that's like just so helpful to understand, as well as like to understand cases where there isn't volatility due to, this happened, like a request happened back to back, and so there was nothing that really changed from there versus one that happened, a day or a week ago or something like that.
How much transparency do you think there is? Like, kind of look at all these tools and look at the documentation. Like, are SEO tool and data providers pretty good about it, or is there a certain opaqueness that you can expect that, like, people aren't really telling you what's under their hoods?
Yeah, I feel like there's certain providers, definitely more open, or, happy to have that conversation, whereas others, um, are cautious because, just like they, where is that, coming from, as well as like, that's a number of people use over and over again, and kind of go from there. So
I feel like on the one hand, there's the aspect of, to your point, the potential for like mucky math, right? Like, just like kind of dirty math that isn't actually, you know, producing a result that's logical. And then there's the other side of things where it's just a protection of proprietary formulas and internal algorithms. I feel like that happens a lot, which makes sense because it's like, if you've come up with some sort of math that you don't like in the SEO tool space, you see a feature come out somewhere and it comes out everywhere else instantly. I can imagine the proprietary math is one of those components that you can hold close to your heart and not have it stolen.
yeah, I think that makes sense, but I feel like people need to know how that's calculated, and
Yeah.
like to take it with a grain of salt, or to, understand like, one saying 46, one saying 48. Is there a difference? Probably not, but it gives you just an indicator of where to go from there. So
And I think that's fair because we look, you and I have had discussions about the methodology of any of the research studies that are done. And, if people don't put the methodology out there, then you can't really have any sort of trustworthiness in the results of the experiment or the research, like in terms of like the scale or the volume, or the type of data that they chose. Like, that's problematic.
yeah, it's interesting you kind of talk about that, but I'd love for people just to open up that data and be like, here, go at it. I mean, it is kind of also intimidating to people. Like, I had a 24 gigabyte JSON file the other day that I had to process, and like, even just viewing that and understanding like, how can I take a look at this data and understand in there, can be a challenge. But it's also interesting because once you do kind of break down that data, it's like, okay, now I have something we can start working with and going from there.
Yeah, I mean, data analysis and being a data scientist is so fascinating because it's like you need the tools to be able to process everything, but then you need just the critical thinking of like how to look at the data. And that's something that could take a lifetime to really figure out, to really get to that point of like you can surface these insights. I mean, that's why y'all build the tools though. We're getting to the end. I do want to ask you a little bit about some of the technical challenges that you actually run into with data aggregation at scale. So when you're looking at hundreds of thousands of keywords year over year, we're talking a little bit about the data pipeline. What's challenging as you scale?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it is more just like the infrastructure and cost and how to handle processing. So, there's a lot of things that you need multiple back end systems to be able to do, kind of like post requests. So, you may be expecting to get back a ton of data, and then, each request is going to take you X number of seconds to process. And and just being able to build an infrastructure with queues and workers so that you'd be able to scale up workers and have the queues absorb it. Definitely a good practice there, but it's also just challenging, thinking through and seeing some of the differences and how can you say like, okay, like these two are, similar but not the same, or is this something that I need to really save and store and care about. So
it sounds like as you scale, it's really important to kind of mind your efficiencies and really make everything as clean as possible, because the more unwieldy it gets, that's where things break down. And to your point, if you don't have those alerts, like the whole machine can come crashing down sooner rather than later.
yeah, definitely like anomaly detection or other things to keep you just to understand, what's going on, as well as, to kind of understand where that data is coming from, where is it going, and how you plan to kind of process that. So yeah.
Listen, dude, I could talk to you forever. And it's funny, this is so out of my element too, but I think it's so fascinating, and I have so much admiration for engineers who get under the hood and work with these like really complex sort of, tools and pipelines to be able to use this data in a really helpful way, especially at scale. Um, I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, but if people want to get in touch with you and talk more, I know you had like an awesome thread that blew up on Twitter recently about technical SEOs and building that community, but like where is the best way to get in touch?
Yeah, just reach out to me on Twitter at John Murch. That's definitely the easiest way. Yeah, I definitely been working my way through trying to outreach. Always happy to talk to different technical people and kind of go from there.
That's awesome. Building that community. Thank you so much for chatting and geeking out with me about the technical SEO and talking data.
Yeah, no, definitely, and yeah, thanks for having me. And yeah, this has been super fun and super excited to do more and show more. So we'll go from there.
Yeah, so before we go, just to give a shout out. So next Thursday, John is joining our own Mike King on a awesome free webinar for why is your rank tracking not enough. Going to go in deeper into some of these things, talk about rank tracking, like the history of it and where we're at now, and how to like actually surface valuable rank tracking insights. It's going to be cool. So you can check that out at iPullRank.com/. Webinar hyphen registration. I think that's it. Either way,
Yep.
we'll put it on the link. And then outside of that, it's a hiatus, but keep your eyes peeled for March 3rd when we're going to put out the version 2, a new version of the Rankable podcast with your host, Aaron Johnson. He's going to kick butt. Thank you all for watching and listening. This has been great. We will see you in the future. Peace out.